Imagine this: one quiet phone call from a world-renowned economist in the West to a high-level contact in Beijing. The line rings, it rings again, no answer, no callback, no urgent follow-up meeting, just silence. That single ignored moment wasn't about politics or espionage, it was about economics, cold, hard data on China's soaring debt levels, the massive shadow banking system propping up local governments, and a property sector inflated beyond reason. The warning was crystal clear. The growth model that lifted hundreds of millions out of poverty was hitting unbreakable limits. Unsustainable investment, suppressed household consumption, hidden leverage everywhere. Continue on this path, the economist urged, and the cracks would widen into fractures that no stimulus could hide. Beijing didn't pick up, figuratively or perhaps even literally. The red flags were dismissed as Western bias, outdated thinking, or interference. Officials doubled down on the familiar playbook: more infrastructure, more credit, more control. The economy kept churning, headlines stayed positive, and the world watched China power ahead. But beneath the surface, the buildup was relentless. Developers borrowed trillions. Homebuyers poured life savings into unfinished towers. Banks extended loans they couldn't afford to lose. The property bubble, once the engine of growth, became a ticking liability. Then the tremors started. Evergrande teetered, Country Garden followed. Millions of families watched their wealth evaporate. Local governments scrambled to service hidden debts. Youth unemployment spiked. Consumption froze as confidence collapsed. Global supply chains felt the strain. Commodities slumped. Factories idled. Trade partners recalculated. This wasn't a sudden crash with fireworks. It was a slow, grinding erosion that spread uncertainty worldwide. Stock markets wobbled. Inflation shifted. Geopolitical tensions sharpened as economic weakness met strategic ambition. And what happened next quietly reshaped everything. One quiet, unanswered phone call from a world-renowned economist delivered a stark warning about China's hidden economic time bomb: debt, property bubbles, and an unsustainable growth model. Picture the scene: late 2010s, perhaps early 2020s. A senior economist, someone whose name carries weight in global finance circles, a figure who has advised governments and predicted crises before they hit, picks up the phone. He dials a trusted, high-level contact inside China's economic policy-making apparatus, maybe a former student now in a key ministry position, or a discreet channel through an international institution. The call connects. The line rings once, twice. The economist waits, ready to deliver a message that has been building in his mind for years. When the other side finally answers, or perhaps it goes to voicemail, the details remain hazy. The warning pours out with calm precision. China's headline growth numbers look invincible: 6%, 7%, even as the world slowed. But look closer, he says. Total debt has climbed past 300% of GDP. Local governments hide trillions in off-balance sheet borrowing through local government financing vehicles. Shadow banking has exploded, feeding an insatiable appetite for real estate. Developers borrow at dizzying levels to buy land, build towers, and sell apartments before the concrete even dries. Households pour life savings into property, convinced prices can only go up. The entire model, investment-led, credit-fueled, export and infrastructure-heavy, relies on one assumption: growth will always outrun the debt. This isn't speculation, the economist stresses. The numbers are public, the patterns clear. Japan in the late 1980s showed what happens when asset bubbles meet easy credit. The United States in 2008 demonstrated how interconnected finance can transmit shockwaves globally. China is bigger than both combined. If the property sector stalls, if confidence cracks, if credit tightens even slightly, the feedback loops could be brutal. Developers default, banks take hits, local governments lose revenue, consumption freezes as families cling to what's left of their wealth. The central government steps in with stimulus, but each round is less effective, each injection more expensive. The message is urgent but measured. Slow the credit machine now. Rebalance toward household consumption. Let some developers fail to clear excess capacity. Accept slower headline growth to avoid a hard landing later. Reform land rights. Strengthen social safety nets. Reduce reliance on real estate as the primary wealth creation engine. Do it while the economy still has momentum. Delay, and the correction will be forced. Messier, more painful, harder to control. The call ends. Silence follows. No immediate public acknowledgement. No policy pivot announced. No headlines about a dramatic intervention. Instead, the familiar machinery keeps turning. More bond issuance. More infrastructure announcements. More encouragement for developers to guarantee delivery of pre-sold apartments. The property market is declared fundamentally sound. Officials repeat that China's situation is unique. State control, high savings rate, massive domestic market, making it immune to the mistakes of others. Yet the Economist's data did not lie. Leverage kept rising. Evergrande's balance sheet ballooned to over $300 billion in liabilities. Country Garden and dozens of others followed similar paths. Pre-sold homes piled up, unfinished. Home buyers stopped paying mortgages in protest. Youth unemployment climbed as construction and related sectors shed jobs. Local governments, starved of land sale revenue, leaned harder on hidden debt. The central bank injected liquidity repeatedly, but each wave bought less time. The ignored call was not the cause. The imbalances were already there, built over decades of breakneck growth, but it was a clear, expert signal, a last polite invitation to change course before the momentum became unstoppable. Beijing did not take the exit ramp. It accelerated down the highway, betting that control and scale could defy economic gravity one more time. What followed was not a sudden implosion with global headlines screaming, "China collapses." It was quieter, more insidious, a grinding slowdown, a property sector that went from engine to anchor, a middle class that felt poorer even as official statistics stayed optimistic, a global economy that slowly recalibrated around a China that could no longer pull as hard. Commodity prices softened, shipping rates dropped, multinationals revised expansion plans, geopolitical calculations shifted as economic weakness met rising strategic assertiveness. That one unanswered call hangs in the background like a ghost note. It reminds us that warnings, even from the most credible voices, can be dismissed when the numbers still look good on paper. And when they are ignored, the consequences arrive not with a bang, but with the slow, relentless pressure of reality catching up. Beijing chose silence. The red flags were dismissed as Western exaggeration, outdated thinking, or interference, allowing the same high-risk playbook to continue unchecked for years. The Economist's words landed, were noted, perhaps even debated in closed-door meetings, but the response was not action, it was deflection. Officials pointed to China's unique national conditions: massive domestic savings, strong state oversight, a controlled banking system, and the ability to direct resources at scale. Western critics, they argued, had repeatedly predicted collapse: Japan's lost decade, the Asian financial crisis, the 2008 global meltdown, and China had always defied the doomsayers. Why listen now when growth was still humming at 6 to 7%, when cities kept rising, when export numbers remained strong, when poverty eradication campaigns were hailed worldwide as a historic success? The red flags were reframed as foreign envy or misunderstanding. Debt levels, necessary for development, property prices, reflecting genuine demand in a rapidly urbanizing society, shadow banking, a flexible channel filling gaps left by traditional finance, Evergrande and similar giants, private companies taking calculated risks, not systemic threats. Each warning from abroad was met with the same narrative: China knows its own economy best. Outsiders lack context. Their models don't apply here. This dismissal was not passive. It was reinforced by policy continuity. The central government kept the credit taps open. Local officials were still incentivized by GDP targets, so they kept borrowing through financing vehicles to fund bridges, highways, high-speed rail extensions, and new industrial parks. Developers were encouraged to keep building. Pre-sales financed the next project, creating a self-perpetuating cycle. Regulators tightened rules on occasion. The Three Red Lines policy in 2020 was one attempt, but enforcement was uneven, and when pain appeared, stimulus followed quickly. Lower reserve requirements, targeted lending programs, calls for banks to support quality real estate firms. Year after year, the playbook stayed the same because it had worked before. In 2008-09, massive stimulus pulled China through the global crisis faster than anyone else. In 2015-16, when stock markets wobbled and capital outflows surged, authorities stabilized the system with decisive intervention. The pattern bred confidence. Problems can always be managed. Growth can always be engineered. Corrections can always be delayed. Admitting structural limits would mean accepting slower growth, painful deleveraging, potential social unrest from falling property values, and a loss of face on the global stage where China was positioned as the rising alternative to Western decline. So the ignored call became part of a broader pattern of selective hearing. International organizations like the IMF and BIS issued measured cautions in their reports: rising corporate debt, interconnected risks between property and local finance, the need for rebalancing, but these were acknowledged politely and then set aside. Domestic voices raising similar concerns, some academics, a few retired officials, were quietly sidelined or reframed as constructive but not urgent. Meanwhile, the imbalances deepened. Total social financing grew faster than nominal GDP. Property inventory in lower-tier cities ballooned. Household balance sheets became heavily tilted toward real estate, often 70–80% of wealth tied up in apartments. Developers layered debt upon debt, relying on ever-increasing sales to service old obligations. Banks accumulated exposure through disguised channels. Local governments grew dependent on land sales that only flowed when prices kept rising. The silence after that call was comfortable. It allowed the system to keep running on the fuel it knew: credit expansion, investment, urbanization. No radical shift was needed when the old engine still turned. Growth targets were met or exceeded. Leaders received applause at party congresses. The narrative of unstoppable rise held firm in state media and international perceptions. But silence has a cost. Each year of delay made the eventual adjustment harder. Leverage ratios climbed higher. The property sector's share of the economy swelled beyond sustainable levels. Confidence became brittle, dependent on the belief that prices would never fall, that the state would always backstop the system, that growth would never truly slow. By the time visible stress emerged, Evergrande's liquidity crisis in 2021, the wave of mortgage boycotts in 2022, the sharp drop in new home starts, the room for soft correction had narrowed. The high-risk playbook had been extended far past its safe limits. What began as a choice to ignore one expert warning had become an entrenched posture: maintain momentum at all costs, manage problems as they arise, never admit systemic vulnerability. That posture carried China through another half-decade of apparent strength, but it also ensured that when the reckoning arrived, it would be deeper, more widespread, and far harder to contain than if course had been corrected earlier. The silence after the call was not indifference. It was a deliberate bet on control over caution, on continuity over change, on the belief that this time truly would be different. What looked like unstoppable momentum was actually a slow-motion buildup: trillions in shadow debt, ghost cities, and families betting life savings on ever-rising property prices. From the outside, China's economy appeared invincible. Skyscrapers pierced the clouds in Tier 1 cities. High-speed rail networks expanded like veins across the country. New districts sprang up overnight, complete with malls, schools, hospitals. Official GDP figures climbed steadily, Even as the rest of the world grappled with slowdowns, headlines praised the China Miracle Redux, lifting another 100 million into the middle class, dominating global manufacturing, becoming the world's factory and buyer of commodities. The momentum felt unstoppable because for 2 decades it largely had been. Beneath that polished surface, however, a different story was being written in numbers that few outside elite circles fully grasped. Total debt, government, corporate, household, surged past 300% of GDP, among the highest ratios for any major economy. Much of it hid in the shadows. Local government financing vehicles, LGFVs, issued bonds and took loans off the official books to fund infrastructure that generated little immediate revenue. Developers borrowed heavily from trust companies, wealth management products, and informal channels to acquire land at auction and launch ever larger projects. Banks extended credit through disguised channels to keep the cycle spinning. The shadow banking system ballooned to trillions of yuan, filling gaps that formal regulation had tried to close. The property sector became the beating heart of this buildup. Real estate and related industries accounted for roughly 25–30% of GDP when indirect effects were included: construction, steel, cement, furniture, appliances, home decoration. Developers sold apartments years before completion, using presale funds to finance the next phase. Buyers, often families pooling resources from multiple generations, treated property as the ultimate safe asset in a country with limited investment alternatives. Stock markets were volatile, bank deposits offered low returns, overseas options were restricted, so apartments became the default store of wealth. Prices rose relentlessly in major cities, reinforcing the belief that they could only go higher. Speculative demand fed supply, which fed more borrowing, which fed more construction. Entire new districts, sometimes called ghost cities, emerged on the outskirts of provincial capitals. Towers stood empty, streets quiet, lights off at night. Yet sales continued because local governments relied on land sale revenue to service their own hidden debts. Developers needed to keep selling to roll over maturing loans. Buyers kept purchasing because everyone around them was doing the same, and stories of overnight wealth from flipping apartments were everywhere. The cycle created its own gravity. As long as credit flowed and confidence held, the machine kept turning. Households bore the heaviest invisible burden. Surveys showed that property often represented 70–80% of family wealth, far higher than in most developed economies. Many middle-class families took out mortgages at the peak, stretching finances thin. Young couples delayed marriage or children because saving for a down payment consumed years of income. The elderly liquidated savings or borrowed against pensions to help children buy homes. The national savings rate stayed extraordinarily high, but much of it was locked in illiquid bricks rather than circulating as consumption. This buildup was slow motion, because no single event triggered alarm bells loud enough to force a halt. Growth stayed positive. Unemployment remained low on official measures. Exports remained robust. The central government retained vast reserves and control over the banking system. Crises elsewhere, Greece in 2010, the U.S. subprime meltdown, had been far more abrupt. China's version was gradual, almost stealthy. Developers met payments by launching new projects. Banks extended maturities quietly. Regulators issued warnings but allowed workarounds. The system adapted, absorbed shocks, and kept expanding. Yet adaptation had limits. Each round of credit expansion bought time but increased fragility. More debt chased the same pool of genuine demand. Overcapacity in housing grew acute in lower-tier cities. Demographic trends turned unfavorable. The population aged, birth rates plunged, urbanization slowed as the easiest rural-to-urban shift was already done. The pool of first-time buyers shrank while the stock of unsold or unfinished homes swelled. The momentum that once lifted China now weighed on it. Construction slowed, steel mills idled, cement plants cut output, land auctions drew fewer bidders, home prices in many cities stagnated or fell for the first time in a generation. Developers faced liquidity squeezes as sales dried up and refinancing became harder. Households felt the pinch, wealth effects reversed, confidence eroded, spending tightened. Local governments, starved of land revenue, struggled to pay teachers, civil servants, and hidden debt interest. What had looked like unstoppable forward motion was, in reality, a carefully managed acceleration toward a wall. The trillions in shadow debt, the ghost towers, the families who had bet everything on rising prices, these were not side effects. They were the engine itself. And when that engine began to sputter, the slowdown was not dramatic at first. It was quiet, persistent, cumulative, 1,000 small contractions adding up to something far larger than any single missed payment or failed project. When the cracks finally surfaced, the fallout wasn't loud chaos, but a grinding global ripple. Vanishing wealth, frozen confidence, strained supply chains, and a quiet reshaping of the world economy. The first visible signs were almost polite. In late 2021, Evergrande missed a bond payment. Headlines called it a liquidity issue. Analysts reassured, too big to fail, the government would step in. But the intervention never came in the sweeping, decisive form people expected. Instead, piecemeal measures followed. Some projects got priority funding to finish apartments, select developers received targeted loans, regulators tightened, but then loosened rules again. The message was clear: stabilize, don't explode. But stabilization came at the cost of prolonged uncertainty. Property sales slowed sharply. New home starts plunged by double digits year after year. Prices in many second and third-tier cities began to soften, then stagnate, then fall. For millions of families who had treated real estate as their primary retirement plan, the wealth effect reversed overnight. Paper gains vanished. Down payments that had consumed years of savings now looked like sunk costs on unfinished towers. Mortgage boycotts spread in 2022 as buyers refused payments on delayed projects, fearing their money would disappear. Confidence eroded not in a panic, but in quiet conversations at dinner tables. Maybe we wait before buying the next apartment. Maybe we save cash instead. Local governments felt the pain acutely. Land sales, once their golden goose, dried up as developers bid less or not at all. Revenue shortfalls forced cuts. Delayed salaries for teachers and civil servants, scaled back public services, increased reliance on central transfers. Hidden debts through financing vehicles became harder to service without fresh land income. Provinces and cities scrambled for creative financing, special bonds, asset swaps, central government bailouts disguised as restructuring. The fiscal strain rippled upward, constraining Beijing's ability to launch massive new stimulus without inflating debt further. Consumption froze. Households, already leveraged and now poorer on paper, pulled back. Retail sales growth slowed, car purchases dipped. Travel and dining remained subdued even after pandemic restrictions lifted. Youth unemployment hit record highs as construction, real estate services, and related industries shed jobs. New graduates faced a job market where entry-level positions vanished and lying flat became a cultural shorthand for quiet withdrawal from the rat race. The middle class, once the engine of domestic demand, turned cautious, hoarding savings rather than spending. The global ripple was subtle at first, then unmistakable. Iron ore prices softened as Chinese steel mills cut output. Australian and Brazilian miners felt the pinch. Copper demand eased, hitting Chile and Peru. Australian coal exports slowed. Global shipping rates, inflated during the pandemic, collapsed as Chinese imports of raw materials and consumer goods weakened. Container traffic through major ports declined. Multinational companies revised China growth forecasts downward, delayed factory expansions, diversified supply chains toward Vietnam, India, Mexico. The China Plus One strategy accelerated not out of geopolitics alone, but because economic reality demanded it. Financial markets absorbed the shock in waves. Chinese stocks underperformed global peers for years. Offshore yuan bonds saw spreads widen. Foreign investors pulled back from Chinese equities and debt, wary of policy unpredictability and property exposure. Capital outflows pressured the currency, forcing the PBOC to intervene with reserves and tighter controls. The world's second-largest economy, long seen as the indispensable growth driver, began to look more like a source of downside risk. Geopolitical calculations shifted quietly. A weaker domestic economy made Beijing more sensitive to external pressures, trade restrictions, technology sanctions, commodity access. At the same time, economic strain sharpened internal priorities: social stability, employment, food security, self-reliance in critical technologies. The balance between opening up and controlling tightened further. International perceptions evolved. China was no longer just the unstoppable juggernaut. It was a giant managing internal contradictions with vast but finite resources. The fallout never produced the classic crash narrative. No Lehman-style collapse, no sovereign default, no widespread bank runs. The system's controls, state-owned banks, capital controls, propaganda, administrative guidance, prevented that. But prevention came at a price. Prolonged stagnation, zombie companies kept alive on life support, misallocated capital, and a generation of young people entering adulthood with diminished expectations. The middle-income trap loomed closer, not as theory but as lived experience. What began as ignored warnings and extended high-risk policies ended in a slow, grinding adjustment. Wealth evaporated without fanfare, confidence eroded drop by drop, supply chains reconfigured incrementally, the global economy recalibrated around a China that pulled less weight, grew more slowly, and projected less certainty. The reshaping was quiet because it unfolded over years, not months, yet its scale was profound, touching every corner of interconnected finance, trade, and geopolitics in ways that would take decades to fully map. In the end, that one unanswered call became a quiet epitaph for an era. The Economist's warning wasn't wrong, it was simply early. China didn't collapse in flames, it slowed, strained, and reshaped itself under pressure it could no longer outrun. Trillions in shadow debt turned from fuel into anchor. Families watched dreams built on concrete fade into unfinished towers. The world economy, long addicted to China's relentless pull, learned to walk with a limp. Supply chains rerouted, commodity supercycles ended, growth forecasts rewritten. What started as ignored advice became a slow global recalibration. Less certainty, more caution, a multipolar reality where no single engine drives everything. Beijing adapted, survived, but the cost was etched in lost momentum, eroded confidence, and a generation facing narrower horizons. The real lesson isn't about one phone call. It's about how even the mightiest systems can ignore gravity until gravity answers back. And what happened next quietly reshaped everything.